So back to glyphosate. This Roundup, Monsanto, glyphosate, you put it all together, and I really think it's the poster child for what we're talking about. It's the poster child for a very big problem with prevalent, pervasive pesticide use in agriculture. Again, Monsanto brought this to market in 1974. It has been touted as being so safe, safe as table salt, safe enough to drink, you know, this wonderful, magical chemical that's going to feed the world. And as a result, it's, you know, farmers use it, homeowners use it, it's used, cities and counties use it in parks and playgrounds, it's used in forestry management. This chemical has become so pervasive that our government scientists have documented it in rainfall, in air and soil samples, as well as, of course, in our own bodies because we are consuming it on a regular basis. So, you know, this is a pretty important chemical, and I thought it was worthwhile to take a deep dive into this and to see how this company worked through the regulatory process and with farmers and everything to really push this to such pervasive levels. So what I've seen, one of the things that they've done, and you may have read all about this, is that they have really weighed in heavily and manipulated to a certain degree the scientific literature, so that you haven't heard about the risks. You've heard about, say, you know, safe as table salt, safe enough to drink. You've heard a lot of the propaganda and the benefits. You haven't heard the risks. Well, all of this caught up with Monsanto in 2015. The use of this chemical had become so pervasive that the International Agency for Research on Cancer, which is part of the World Health Organization, decided that they should do a review of all of the scientific literature and classify this. This is something that they do. This is their job, to look at different substances that we consume or are exposed to, look at the scientific literature and determine if it should be classified as a carcinogen or not. And these are independent scientists from around the world that aren't getting paid by anybody with the dog in the fight. And they come together and they were looking at 3 different chemicals, 3 different pesticides in 2015. And they ultimately, for glyphosate, decided that it should be ranked as a probable human carcinogen based on very many years and years of published peer-reviewed scientific studies. And they looked at epidemiology and toxicology and mechanistic data. And they found a particular association to non-Hodgkin lymphoma. Now, this is directly in contradiction to the EPA, of course, and to regulators around the world, which all say, nah, we've looked at science and it doesn't cause cancer. We don't think it causes cancer. We think IARC is wrong. So there's been a lot of discussion and debate about this, of course. And this is a paper that was published just earlier in January by a scientist who's been following this as long as I have, or maybe perhaps longer. And he's been involved actually in the litigation as a consultant because he's so familiar with this. But he analyzed what was the difference between what IARC looked at and what our regulators look at. And what he found was the regulators relied much more heavily on studies that were given to them by Monsanto and other players in the chemical industry, which found no ties to cancer. Whereas IARC relied much more heavily on independent studies that were not done by Monsanto. And in fact, the majority of those did find ties to cancer. So that's where that dispute comes in. Now, IARC, I'm sure you've read about this. This has been big news. After the IARC announcement, of course, it's a probable human carcinogen with particular association to non-Hodgkin lymphoma, people just started suing, you know, right and left. And the law firms started popping up and representing these different clients. This is 9,000. Today I heard over 10,000. It's growing pretty rapidly in terms of the number of people. They're all of these plaintiffs have non-Hodgkin lymphoma, and they are all alleging that not only did they get this cancer because of their exposure to glyphosate-based herbicides sold by Monsanto, but they're alleging that Monsanto knew about these risks and that they've hidden it, and they've covered it up, and they've manipulated science, and they've colluded with regulators. And all of that is in my book. Because there's so much documentation of that, and it's so disheartening. when you realize sort of what's going on behind the scenes. But it's also illuminating as well, and hopefully educational. So again, we have this lawsuit. The very first trial was this summer. The jury unanimously found in favor of the plaintiff, awarded the plaintiff $289 million. A judge later reduced that to $78 million. Monsanto is still appealing that $78 million. So what has happened during this litigation is that the lawyers for the plaintiffs, of course, have been able to do discovery on Monsanto. And so they have been able to obtain tens of millions of internal documents from Monsanto, emails and strategy reports and all sorts of internal communications. And I, for my book and for my other work, have done Freedom of Information Act requests. I've had to sue the EPA 2 times to get them to turn over documents. And when you put all these documents together, it's just a jaw-dropping look at how our regulators don't protect us and how corporate sway and corporate power and corporate profits are put ahead of public safety and public good. So I don't have all day today, obviously, but a little bit we can talk about these documents in particular that relate to Monsanto and the EPA and USDA and FDA. They show many, many occasions in which Monsanto has ghostwritten works that is in the scientific literature that speaks to the safety of glyphosate herbicides. We've seen their fingerprints. You see them talk about internally about ghostwriting different studies. You see when regulators do have evidence of carcinogenicity, you see how Monsanto and their allies in the industry come in with alternative assessments and get the EPA to change its mind about what it's seen. There was a great story in the book, or maybe a very tragic story in the book, about EPA scientists who say, gosh, we're looking at this study and it looks like this stuff causes cancer. All these mice have tumors. This causes cancer. And Monsanto says, no, you don't know what you're talking about. We're going to talk to your bosses and we're going to take care of this. And what ensues is a few years of back and forth, and EPA tells Monsanto to redo the study, and Monsanto says, we're not going to redo these studies. And basically, EPA management eventually overrides its own scientists in favor of Monsanto, which made some of those scientists really angry, as might be expected. There's an email dating to the 1980s in which an EPA scientist is writing to Monsanto and he's saying, it is not my job to protect you. It's my job to protect the public, but he was overridden. We've seen articles in like Forbes magazine that you think comes from this from an independent academic guy. It sounds interesting. And then you find out through the documents that it was written by a Monsanto PR person. We have them discussing how to put blogs and things, get those posted on WebMD, other websites, so that they look again. The whole strategy is to look like it's coming from independent scientists, to look like it's not associated with Monsanto. So it's going to be more authentic, and you're going to tend to believe it more. And you see them strategize about how to do that over and over and over. And then you see them forming what we call front groups, but different organizations that have websites and things that are pushing messages of, feed the world and how safe these things are. And you see that they're getting money and direction and collaboration from Monsanto in exchange for this. Monsanto did not want these documents introduced into court, and they've tried to keep them sealed from public view. And this is just a quote from the judge, one of the judges in the case, and you can see where he talks about, and he says, this internal correspondence, it could support a jury finding that Monsanto has long been aware of the risks that its glyphosate-based herbicides are carcinogenic, but has continuously sought to influence the scientific literature to prevent its internal concerns from reaching the public sphere. So this is even from the judge, looking at this and realizing that this could spell trouble for Monsanto. So I wanted to share just a few of these emails. I don't know if you can see it very well, but I think it's really enlightening to see that before IARC even met. Monsanto was so worried about this. They were so worried that IARC was going to take a look at the science and issue a classification for glyphosate. Now, after the classification, Monsanto very publicly was outraged, shocked and outraged. But internally, before IARC, you can see that Monsanto expected this. They expected that they were very vulnerable. They say in this internal email, we have vulnerability in epidemiology, exposure, genotox, mode of action. They say we've long been concerned that IARC is going to take a look at glyphosate. And then you see them talk about that they need to prepare. They knew that it was going to rate either a probable or a possible carcinogen classification because they were aware of the science. And they talk about this internally. And then what they do is they start planning how they're going to attack IARC. And again, all of this is before IARC even met, before IARC even made its classification. They had this internal document called a Preparedness and Engagement Plan for IARC, Carcinogen Rating of Glyphosate. And the idea was to generally orchestrate an outcry so that, again, there would be a lot of people, scientists and consumer groups and others, who would be outraged and they would outcry about, this crooked group of cancer scientists, how dare they classify glyphosate as a probable carcinogen. And so Monsanto lays out how they're going to do this. And again, here's an internal email, which I don't know if you can read it or not. They start talking about how, they want to get some counter papers published. They want to get a group of scientists who are going to lay out how wrong IARC is, and they're going to get this published in a journal. But again, they don't want anybody, Monsanto can't be part of writing it. It's going to be an independent review. But you see in here, they're talking about how, what we could do, we'll just add Grime, Keir, Kirkland, we'll put their names on the publication, but we'll keep the cost down. We'll do the writing. They just edit and sign it. Remember, that's how we handled William Croson Monroe 2000. So this is enlightening for two reasons, because you look at this and you're like, oh my gosh, they're talking themselves, about how they're going to ghostwrite a paper for a scientific publication. But you also see, they say, remember, that's what we did with the study from 2000. The William Croson Monroe 2000 paper is foundational for the regulatory reviews of glyphosate. The EPA has cited William Croson Monroe over and over and over again, and so have European regulators. They all point to that paper and they say, look, this paper shows us how safe it is. We see here in this email, Monsanto's going, yeah, we ghostwrote that. So here is this, the result of this plan, of this independent paper to refute IARC. It's called A Review of the Carcinogenic Potential of Glyphosate by 4 independent expert panels, and it was published, and it went through, got a lot of attention and went through all the reasons that IARC was wrong. But then what you see in these internal emails is not only was Monsanto talking about ghostwriting it, but they really did a lot of work on it. There's a declaration at the end of this independent panel paper that says neither any Monsanto company employee nor any attorney reviewed any of this manuscript. And then you see in the internal email, they're saying, this is a Monsanto scientist, Bill Hayden, saying, yeah, I already wrote the draft introduction chapter. I went back, I reread it, I'm doing some refreshing, I'm doing this. And he's trying to figure out who the authors are going to be. And then comes the question, who should be the ultimate author? This has been very controversial because, again, these papers are published in a scientific journal. They're supposed to carry weight and authenticity. And to see that Monsanto has such a hand in it, while the declaration said they did not, really got the journal in some hot water. And the journal recently has issued some clarifications and some expressions of concern and that sort of thing. There are a lot of people that think it should be retracted altogether. This is another example of what critics say is really sort of some secret and subversive practices. This is a report that European policymakers commissioned to have look at a German safety assessment report on glyphosate that, again, said it was so very safe. IARC is crazy. All these scientists who think that it could be dangerous or carcinogenic are wrong. This was a German government report. Well, what the European regulators found when they commissioned this study was that well more than 50% of this government assessment was pulled, copied and pasted, pulled directly from Monsanto's Glyphosate Task Force. They're calling it essentially plagiarism. But it again shows you that these regulatory agencies that are supposed to be, our protector and supposed to be the watchdog on our behalf are really often just being led by the nose, maybe. Oh, I didn't advance. There you go. 50%. All that in red is what's been copied and pasted. And this is one more example. This one really I found outrageous a little bit. This was our ATSDR, which is part of Health and Human Services, and it's a Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry. It's a sort of a sister group to CDC, but again, they're supposed to be protecting the public, and they wanted to look at glyphosate to see about toxicity issues and concerns. Monsanto didn't want them to. So you see these are from internal emails. Monsanto saying, we're trying to do everything we can to keep from having a domestic IARC occur. So what you see, and I can't put it all in here, but I did write this story in the Huffington Post. You see this whole string of emails where they go to the top guy at the EPA, Office of Pesticide Programs, a guy named Jim Jones, and basically enlist his help to make this go away, to make this review and this assessment of glyphosate go away. And he does. And he responds immediately, and he gets his second guy in command, Jack Hausinger, and Jack jumps on it, and you see them work so closely with Monsanto. We have text messages and emails back and forth, and they bend over backwards to basically make sure that this ATSDR is not going to review glyphosate toxicity. And this is one of the EPA officials, if you've heard this, there's a line in one of the emails where they talk about this EPA official saying, if I can kill this, I should get a medal. Other things that they do, front groups, I talked about this a little bit, propaganda groups, front groups, academics review, genetic literacy project. There's a lovely one called American Council on Science and Health. We have a great email chain from them where they're saying, we need you to give us some more money, Monsanto. We've been doing a lot of work here defending glyphosate. You could really use a little more money. At the same time, they're representing themselves to the public as completely independent. Academics review is kind of a fun one because I was one of their targets. They went after me pretty heavily while I was at Reuters and assigned me an F for a lot of the stories that I wrote about the industry and things. But you see in internal emails where they were organized and set up by a PR guy from Monsanto who gave them a list of targets to go after. And they talked about how we want to make sure that, Monsanto's in the background. Nobody needs to know that Monsanto's part of this because it would affect their credibility. So what's happened with all of this sort of spinning and propaganda and whatever you want to call it, front groups and things, is glyphosate use has exploded. We talked about how pervasive it is. And this is somewhat of an older chart, 2011. I guess I'm too lazy to look up a new one, but this was government data, and it just shows you back in the 1990s, the brown area was glyphosate use, and here in the 2000s, 2011, you can see the brown areas expanded. Well, we've expanded now. We're up to about 300 million pounds a year in the U.S. of glyphosate use, and that was 40 million pounds in the 1990s. And we're up from about 124 million pounds worldwide to about 2 billion pounds now used of this glyphosate weed killer. And that's why I think it's the poster child. It's so pervasive, and it's made billions and billions of dollars for Monsanto. It's now off patent, and so other companies sell glyphosate-based herbicides as well. It's everywhere, and this is just a list of foods that the EPA has in an internal report. Glyphosate used in producing dozens of common foods. And this is the government tracks it, and they give an estimated annual use. And these are in pounds so that you can see a lot of people think it's just corn and soybeans, but it's not. It's used with wheat and barley, and it's used in nut production. It's used, with almonds. It's used in citrus groves and orange production. This is very important to a lot of farmers, and it's even used in vineyards. It's been found in wine. It goes into the soil, and it's pervasive, and it's taken up into the plant. And there's a whole lot. I get into my book a little bit just about the problems with the soil that are created by this overuse, this constant repeated use of glyphosate, and how it affects soil and the microbiome in the soil, and how that affects plant health. There's a lot of things to get into there. One thing that seems to get people is honey. It's even found in honey. And we know this because the FDA internally, while they have never tested for glyphosate in all of these years, and the USDA has not tested for glyphosate in all of these years, they've started to get in trouble. And in 2014, the Government Accountability Office said, USDA, FDA, you need to start testing for this thing. It's one of the most widely used chemicals in the world, most widely used herbicide. It's in our food, you need to do it. USDA said, nah, not gonna do it. FDA said, okay, we'll start doing it. So in 2016, they started to do some testing of glyphosate, very limited. One of their chemists, a guy who used to work at Syngenta, who's a very senior chemist at the FDA, started doing tests, and he pulled honey samples from around the United States from store shelves and did testing and found glyphosate in every one of them, and at very high levels that would be considered illegal in Europe and should be considered illegal here, but we don't even have a tolerance. We don't even have a legal level here because we've never anticipated this. He reported this to his supervisors, and his supervisor said, yeah, don't worry about that. Don't worry about that. I'm not going to really report that. That's not going to be part of any public report. The only reason we know about this is because I got Freedom of Information documents from inside the FDA that shows these conversations and shows the data. Another fun Freedom of Information trove of documents showed this very same chemist testing oatmeal products. He specifically looked at baby food oatmeal products and found glyphosate in a lot of these. And these are from store shelves, again, some pretty common brands. And again, he talked about this to officials and his supervisors inside FDA. Again, they chose not to publicly report this to anybody, but what they did do was they reassigned the chemist. And they told the chemist he was not going to be doing any more of this pesticide residue testing. So another chemist inside FDA, again, these Freedom of Information documents are great because they tell you things that the government doesn't ever really want to tell you. So another chemist, this guy was from Arkansas inside the FDA. He's pulling things as part of this testing process. And he reports that he finds it in granola and crackers. He brings these things from home. He says, I've brought wheat crackers, granola, cereal, and cornmeal from home, and there's a fair amount in all of them. And in the email, in the smaller print, if you can see it, he says the only thing he couldn't find it in was broccoli. So hard to get these things. This is a report from Brazil, again showing glyphosate levels in soy-based infant formula. This was something that was concerning to them. General Mills has been hit with a lawsuit. You might have heard about this, finding glyphosate in Cheerios. This was a consumer group testing. This wasn't FDA. Because of the lack of government testing, consumer groups have tried to do a lot of assessments of different commonly consumed foods. And they've, of course, found this in a lot of different things, which has alarmed people. This is a study that came out from researchers at the University of California, San Diego. They've been tracking urine samples from people for 20 years and testing them and looking at glyphosate levels. And this graphic, they put this together, and they said that both the prevalence and the actual levels have risen very dramatically in the last 20 years. This is weed killer in our urine. So if you go out and have your urine tested, which you can do now for glyphosate, you're probably going to have it in there. So just to make sure I make the point that I pick on glyphosate a lot, but again, I it's not the only problem. If glyphosate and Monsanto go away tomorrow, we haven't solved this pesticide problem in our food. This is chlorpyrifos. I mentioned it earlier, the insecticide marketed by Dow Chemical. In this most recent FDA report, it was the 11th most prevalent pesticide found in food. The year prior, it was the 4th most prevalent pesticide. It's found a lot in fruits and veggies, things that you would think are really safe and healthy to feed your children. But in fact, our scientists have found that it's not safe. This is shows you the EPA. They've been ordered now. They were supposed to ban it. They pulled back after talking to Dow Chemical. They've had a court order them now to go ahead and pull this from agriculture. You see the court says, there's scientific evidence that residues cause neurodevelopmental damage in children. This is not really in dispute, the damage we're doing to our kids. But what you hear from the companies and what you hear from the EPA is, yeah, but it's really important to the chemical companies. It's really important to the farmers, and we need to feed the world. So we're not going to worry about little thing like brain damage to kids and ADHD and autism and things like that. This is our pediatricians. They've issued a statement. They're worried about this. They're worried about protecting children because we know that early life development is so important. And when you're exposed to contaminants, when you're exposed to pesticides, you have this increased risk of pediatric cancers as well as all of these other problems. And many pediatric cancers, I don't have a slide on it, but if you look at data, you do see that there are many pediatric cancers on the rise. Just like cancers in general are on the rise, people are surviving. So the death rate is much lower, but more and more people, including children, are getting this in part because of this toxic environment that we've created and that we've allowed.